The World War I stretcher bearer who carried a man with half his face missing for 6 miles, then learned the man was his own cousin and the two had not spoken in 10 years, is a memory that sticks to my ribs like cold, thick mud, the kind that gets in your boots and stays there long after you've finally kicked them off in a clean, quiet house. My name is Elias, and I'm telling you this now because the coffee in this kitchen is getting cold, and the clock on the wall has been ticking in a way that sounds suspiciously like a heartbeat, and I'm tired of hearing it by myself. Most people think a war is defined by the thunder, by the artillery shaking the sky until your teeth feel loose in your gums, but that's the Hollywood version, the one with the orchestral swell and the slow-motion collapse. Real war is a collection of quiet, suffocating moments where you realize you are far too small to be responsible for the things you are seeing. I grew up in a town in Ohio where the biggest worry we had was whether the tractor would start on a Tuesday or if the high school quarterback would finally get his act together for the state finals. It was a good life, heavy on the Sunday pot roasts and light on the existential dread. I had a girl named Sarah who smelled like vanilla and ambition, and we used to sit on the hood of my rusted-out Ford truck, talking about the future like it was something we could just reach out and grab with both hands. I didn't know then that the future isn't a destination, it's a meat grinder, and most of us are just walking toward the blades because we think we're heading home. I signed up because it felt like the thing you did when you looked at the horizon and saw nothing but your own reflection. I thought I was looking for purpose, some grand narrative that would make my life feel earned rather than given. When I boarded that train to boot camp, I was 22, and I thought I was a man because I could shave my face and lift a heavy crate. I didn't know what a man was yet. I didn't know that a man is defined by what he keeps inside his chest when everything else has been stripped away by force. The first few months were just a long, sweaty blur of screaming drill instructors and blisters that popped and bled and calloused over. We were a brotherhood built on shared misery, all of us trying to outrun the boys we used to be. I remember Sergeant Miller, a man who had more scar tissue than soft skin, telling us that the only way to survive was to stop caring about the person you were before the uniform. He said, "You aren't you anymore. You're a cog in a machine that doesn't care if you're dented, so try not to get crushed." We laughed because that's what we did. We laughed at the dark, at the impending doom, at the absurd reality of being young and expendable. I loved those guys. I still do. I can see their faces in the smoke of my cigarette when the house gets too quiet. I remember Kowalski, who had a laugh that sounded like a bag of marbles hitting a wood floor, and Henderson, who carried a worn-out deck of cards that he claimed could tell the future if you drew the right sequence. None of them were prophets, but they were the only mirrors I had left. The deployment didn't start with a bang. It started with the smell, that distinctive, cloying scent of diesel fuel, rot, and stale coffee that seems to cling to your clothes like a ghost. We were stationed at a forward operating base that looked like it had been dropped into a bowl of dry, unforgiving dirt. The heat was a living thing. It moved into your lungs and sat there, making every breath feel like you were drinking hot sand. We spent our days staring at the perimeter, waiting for something to happen, and our nights wondering if we'd ever see a sunset that didn't involve a crater in the background. The tension was constant, a low-frequency hum that vibrated in your bones. You'd be eating a ration pack, staring at a picture of your mom or your girl, and you'd hear a pop in the distance, just a single lonely sound, and suddenly everyone was a statue, frozen, waiting to see if the world was going to end or if it was just another day in the dirt. We played cards until the edges were frayed, and we told lies about what we'd do when we got back, about the steaks we'd eat and the beds we'd sleep in. It was a necessary theater. If we stopped pretending we were going home, we would have just walked into the desert and never turned around. I recall a day when the air felt different, sharp and metallic, like the moments before a lightning strike. We were on patrol near a cluster of crumbling buildings that looked like teeth in an old man's mouth. We were supposed to be securing a supply route, but the silence was too heavy, too thick to be natural. I remember looking at Henderson and seeing him tighten his grip on his rifle, his knuckles white against the black steel. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. We were all reading the same language of instinct. The sun was beating down, turning the landscape into a shimmering, distorted mess of orange and brown, and I remember thinking about a specific summer back in Ohio, the way the creek looked when the light hit the water just right. It was such a peaceful, hollow thought, one that had no business existing in a place where people were trying to erase you. That's the cruelty of it. Your brain keeps trying to anchor you to the world you lost, while your body is busy preparing to leave it. I was thinking about the way my mother used to iron my shirts, the smell of the starch, the rhythmic scrape of the iron against the board, and then the world tilted. It didn't happen with a roar. It happened with a sudden, violent displacement of air that knocked the breath out of me. The dust rose up like a curtain, blinding and choked with grit. I remember falling, the earth hitting my chest, and the immediate, ringing silence that follows an explosion. It's a silence so deep you can hear your own heart hammering against your ribs. I crawled forward, the dirt grinding into my palms, my mind a jagged mosaic of scattered thoughts. I saw movement ahead, just a shape, a shadow in the clearing debris. I moved toward it because that's what you do. You don't think, you don't weigh the risks. You just move because there is someone there, and you are the only one close enough to reach them. I found him lying in a shallow depression, his uniform shredded, his breathing a wet, ragged sound that tore at my insides. I didn't look at his face at first. I just saw the trauma, the urgency, the fact that he was fading, that the light was retreating from his skin. I scooped him up, my shoulders burning, the weight of him pressing down on me like a penance. He was heavier than he looked, or maybe I was just weaker than I thought. I didn't care. I started walking. I didn't have a plan. I just had to get him to the extraction point, 6 miles of burning, hostile ground that seemed to stretch out like an endless, cruel joke. The first mile was adrenaline. The second was pure, unadulterated physical agony. By the third, I was hallucinating, the heat shimmering into shapes of people I used to know. Ghosts of a life that felt like it had been lived by someone else. I kept talking to him, my voice a cracked, dry rasp, telling him that we were almost there, that he was going to be fine, that he just had to keep his eyes open. He didn't answer. He couldn't. I didn't know his name. I didn't know if he was a stranger or a friend. I just knew he was a life, and I was the vessel carrying it. I shifted his weight, his blood slick and hot against my back, a metallic copper smell that filled my nose until I thought I would choke on it. I looked down at his boots, old and worn, and I felt a strange, detached kind of grief. I was doing this for a man whose name I didn't know, a man who might have hated me if he'd been standing, and yet here we were, bound together by the most primal, desperate contract imaginable. I remember thinking about my cousin, a man I hadn't spoken to since a Christmas dinner gone sour a decade ago, a man who had vanished from my life after a petty, stupid argument about nothing that I can't even remember now. I wondered where he was. I wondered if he was still out there, or if he'd become a ghost, just like the thousands of others. I kept walking, my legs screaming, my lungs burning, the weight of the man on my back becoming a physical manifestation of every mistake I'd ever made. I reached a rocky ridge where the shade was sparse and the heat was a solid wall. I had to stop. I slid him down, carefully, my hands trembling as I checked his condition. It was only then, as I wiped the caked dry blood from his forehead and cleared the debris from his eyes, that I finally looked at him, really looked at him. The damage was absolute, a cruel, jagged map of ruin where a face should have been, but the eyes. The eyes were still there, clear and blue and wide with a recognition that hit me harder than the blast ever could have. I felt my entire world freeze, the sound of the wind dying down, the heat vanishing, just this singular moment of impossible, suffocating clarity. I recognized the scar above his left eyebrow, the one he got when we were 10 and tried to jump the stone wall behind his house. I recognized the birthmark on his neck, a small, dark crescent I'd seen 1,000 times when we were kids. He stared at me, and in his eyes I saw the history of a decade of silence, the weight of words unsaid, the realization that we were meeting again in the center of an apocalypse. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there in the dirt, the world spinning in slow, dizzying circles, as the realization of who I had been carrying for 6 miles finally settled into my soul. He tried to speak, his throat working against the damage, a sound emerging that was less a word and more a jagged, broken echo of our shared past. I leaned in, my heart pounding, needing to hear what he had to say, needing to know if he knew who I was as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, accusing shadows across the cratered earth, and the distance to the extraction point suddenly felt like 1,000,000 miles away, and he moved his hand, reaching out. And I caught it, and the world held its breath. His fingers were cold, despite the furnace of the desert sun, and they caught my wrist with a strength that shouldn't have belonged to a man leaking his life into the parched earth. He wasn't just my cousin. He was the kid who had stolen my skateboard, the guy who had shared my first beer behind the old barn, the person who had been the anchor of every childhood memory I had tucked away in the back of my mind to keep them from rusting. Seeing him here in this was like seeing a church burning down in the middle of a war zone. It didn't make sense. It defied the laws of whatever cruel god was overseeing this patch of dust, and yet it was the only thing that was real. I didn't say his name because if I said it, he would be a person again, and if he were a person, I would have to acknowledge that I was watching him die. I stayed in the silence. I leaned in, my cheek brushing against the rough, grit-caked fabric of his uniform, and I just breathed. I could smell the ozone from the blast, the sharp, stinging scent of cordite, and underneath it, the faint, lingering smell of the peppermint soap his mother used to use, a smell that had no business existing in this place of ruin. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But his eyes were a mirror, and in them I saw the exact moment he realized it was me. There was no fear in his expression, just a profound, devastating resignation, the kind you see on a tired dog that's finally stopped running. He He squeezed my wrist again, and I felt the bone in my own arm ache, a dull, throbbing reminder that we were still made of meat and fragility. I pulled him back onto my shoulders, ignoring the way my spine popped and the sudden, sickening surge of bile in my throat. I couldn't leave him. The thought of walking away, of leaving him to the flies and the wind and the vultures, wasn't just impossible. It was a betrayal of every summer night we'd spent on that porch in Ohio. I started moving again, my boots dragging in the sand, leaving a trail of heavy, rhythmic prints that looked like a jagged heartbeat drawn in the dust. The heat was white-hot now, bleaching the world of color until everything was just varying shades of agony. Every step was a negotiation with gravity, a desperate plea to the universe to just let me reach the ridge, just let me get him to the birds, just let me deliver him to someone who could hold the pieces together. I started talking to him, my voice a broken, jagged thing that sounded like gravel grinding together. I told him about the old Ford truck, about the way the engine used to whine when we hit the hill on Route 42, about how Sarah's hair smelled when the wind caught it. I don't know if he heard me. I don't know if he could hear anything over the ringing in his own ears, but I kept talking because if I stopped, the silence would win, and the silence was where the monsters lived. My chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice, the weight of him pressing my lungs down until I was gasping for oxygen that just wasn't there. I tripped over a piece of shrapnel, a jagged shard of metal that had been part of a tank an hour ago and was now just junk, and we went down together in a heap of dust and sweat. I didn't get up immediately. I just lay there for a second, my face pressed into the hot, coarse grit, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath me. It felt like the ground was breathing, like it was hungry, waiting for us to just stop moving so it could reclaim us. I looked at him, lying next to me in the dirt, and I saw that he was still staring at the sky, his eyes unfocused, tracking the slow, predatory circles of a vulture high above. I laughed then. It was a short, sharp, ugly sound that startled me more than the explosion had. I laughed because the absurdity of it was too much, that we had traveled halfway across the globe to bleed out on a piece of dirt that didn't have a name, just to end up together in the middle of nowhere. He didn't laugh back, but his mouth hitched, a tiny, involuntary twitch that told me he knew the joke. I crawled over to him and heaved him up, my shoulders screaming in protest, my muscles burning with the kind of fire that makes you wish for numbness. I started walking again, the rhythm of my steps becoming a mantra, a prayer I was shouting into the emptiness. I saw the extraction point in the distance, a smudge of green and gray against the endless, shimmering orange. And it looked like a mirage, a trick of the light designed to keep me moving until I collapsed. I didn't care if it was real. I focused on it, fixed my gaze on that tiny speck of color, and ignored the way my legs were shaking, the way the world was narrowing down to a tunnel, the way the sound of the wind was being replaced by a high, whistling static. Henderson and Kowalski were waiting there, their faces masks of dirt and exhaustion, and when they saw me, they didn't wave. They didn't cheer, they just moved. They moved with the silent, practiced efficiency of men who had seen too much and were tired of seeing more. They didn't ask questions. They didn't point out who it was I was carrying. They just relieved me of the weight, their hands gentle, their faces tight with a shared, wordless understanding. I watched them lay him on the stretcher, their movements precise and hurried, and I felt a strange, cold detachment. As if I were a spectator watching a scene from a movie I'd already seen a dozen times. I collapsed into the shade of a nearby transport vehicle, my back sliding down the metal skin, my head hitting the frame with a dull, ringing thud. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't block out the image of his eyes, that clear blue recognition that was burned into my mind like a brand. I sat there gasping for air, the world spinning in lazy, nauseating arcs, and I realized that I wasn't just tired. I was hollowed out, as if someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that made me human, leaving behind only the shell. The medic came over, a kid who looked like he hadn't shaved in a week, and he started working on my cousin. I watched him, my gaze unfocused, seeing the way he cleaned the wounds, the way he stitched the torn flesh, the way he moved with a focus that was almost mechanical. I saw the blood, thick and dark, pooling on the floor of the vehicle, and I felt nothing. No fear, no pity, no grief. Just a vast, bottomless nothingness that felt like it was going to swallow me whole. I looked at my hands, stained with his blood, the color shifting from bright crimson to a dull, rusted brown as it dried in the heat. They were the same hands that had held a steering wheel in Ohio, the same hands that had reached for Sarah, the same hands that had once been soft and clean. Now they were weapons, tools, vessels for ruin. I stood up, my legs wobbling, and walked over to the medic. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, watching, waiting for a sign, a miracle, a reason to believe that the world wasn't as broken as it looked. He looked up at me, his eyes tired. A smudge of dirt across his nose, and he shook his head once, slow and deliberate. That was all. No explanation, no comforting lie, no attempt to soften the blow, just that single, crushing motion. I didn't scream. I didn't fall to my knees. I just turned and walked back to the transport, the sound of my own boots crunching on the gravel sounding like bones snapping in the silence. I sat back down in the shade, my back against the metal, and I closed my eyes. The heat was still there, the smell of the diesel was still there, the war was still there, but everything else had shifted. The center of my world had been moved, the axis had tilted, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the marrow that I would never be the same person I was when I woke up that morning. The rest of the day passed in a blur of motion and sound, orders shouted, engines turning over, the chatter of radios, the constant, low-frequency hum of men working, fighting, dying. It all moved around me like water around a stone, indifferent, relentless, uncaring. I stayed where I was, tucked into the shadow of the vehicle, watching the sun drag itself across the sky, feeling the weight of the day settle into my bones, a heavy, permanent anchor that I knew I would be carrying for the rest of my life. I didn't know what happened next. I didn't know how I was going to get through the night, or the next day, or the day after that. I just knew that I was still here, still breathing, still standing in the middle of a world that had forgotten how to be sane. Kowalski came by later, his face smeared with a thick layer of dust, and he handed me a canteen. He didn't ask how I was, he didn't offer any empty platitudes. He just sat down next to me, his shoulder pressing against mine, a solid, grounding presence in the middle of the chaos. We sat there for a long time, the two of us, listening to the night descend. The stars popping into view like holes poked in a dark, velvet curtain. It was cold now, a sharp, biting chill that seeped into your skin, the kind of cold that reminded you that the desert didn't care about you, that it would be here long after you were gone. We didn't talk, there was nothing to say. The silence was full, heavy with the things we had seen, the things we had done, the things we had lost. I drank from the canteen, the water tasting like plastic and metallic dust, and I felt the cold slide down my throat, a stark, bracing shock that made me realize I was still alive, still trapped, still fighting. I looked at Kowalski, his profile sharp against the rising moon, and I felt a surge of something that wasn't quite love, but wasn't quite friendship either. It was a recognition, a shared, silent acknowledgement of the burden we were all carrying, the secret. Heavy knowledge that we were the ones who had survived, and that in a way was the hardest part of all. We spent the night in a state of hypervigilance, our bodies coiled, our minds racing, every snap of a twig, every distant shift of the wind pulling us back to the edge of awareness. The tension was a living thing, prowling through the camp, whispering in the shadows, waiting for us to make a mistake, to let our guard down, to stop being soldiers for even a second. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, staring at the dark, my mind replaying the day, the blast, the walk, the look in his eyes, the final, silent sign from the medic. It all felt like a dream, a nightmare I was waiting to wake up from, a story I would tell myself when I was old and gray, wondering if it had actually happened or if I had invented it to fill the hole in my soul. I kept my hand on my rifle, the metal cold and reassuring against my palm, a steady, constant presence in a world that had become a kaleidoscope of shifting, terrifying possibilities. I felt the weight of the world, of the war, of the life I had left behind, all pressing down on me, squeezing the air out of my chest, forcing me to confront the fact that I was just a man, just a cog in a machine that didn't care if I broke, that didn't care if I lived or died, that didn't care about anything but the mission, the ground, the target. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, I was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. It was a marrow-deep fatigue, a weariness that lived in the joints and the muscles and the very spaces between my ribs. I stood up, my body protesting every movement, and walked over to the perimeter, looking out over the desert as it began to wake, the colors shifting from deep, bruised purple to a sickly, pale yellow. The silence was profound, the kind of silence that usually comes before a storm, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck prickle, a warning I had learned to trust over the past few months. I saw movement, a shadow at the edge of the clearing, a figure that didn't belong, that stood out against the terrain like a smear of ink on a clean page. I didn't shout, I didn't alert the others. I just stood there, watching, waiting for the world to turn, for the inevitable to happen, for the next chapter of this story to be written in blood and sweat and dirt. I felt a strange, cold calm wash over me, a detachment that made me feel like I was floating, like I wasn't even there, just a witness to the unfolding, a ghost haunting the ruins of my own life. The figure moved, and I saw the glint of metal, the flash of an eye. The subtle, unmistakable tension of a man about to act. I didn't think, I didn't hesitate, I didn't weigh the consequences. I just reacted, my body moving with the muscle memory I had spent months refining, the training kicking in, the instinct for survival taking the wheel. I felt the weight of the weapon in my hands, the steady, rhythmic pulse of the trigger, the violent, jarring kick of the recoil. It was a blur of motion, a kaleidoscope of flashes and sounds, a frantic, desperate dance on the edge of the precipice. I saw the shadow fall, the movement stop, the silence returning, but this time it was different. It was a silence of completion, of finality, of a debt paid, a loop closed. I stood there for a long time, the smoke from the barrel curling into the morning air, my ears ringing with the echo of the shots, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel relief. I just felt a deep, profound, hollow sadness that settled over me like a shroud. I had done my job. I had survived. I had, in some way, balanced the scales. And yet, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a funeral. Henderson came up behind me, his hand on my shoulder, his face unreadable in the morning light. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, his eyes searching, trying to read the state of my soul. I didn't meet his gaze. I just kept looking at the spot where the shadow had been, the place where the world had shifted again, where the lines had been redrawn. I felt a strange, quiet gratitude for his presence, for the simple, undeniable fact that he was there, that I wasn't alone in this wasteland of broken dreams and shattered lives. We stood there for a long time, the morning light growing, the desert revealing its harsh, unforgiving beauty, the world moving on, indifferent to the small, violent drama that had just played out on its surface. I knew then that I wouldn't be the same. I knew that the man who had come to this place looking for purpose had died in the desert, and the man who was left, the man who was standing there in the dirt, was something else entirely. I didn't know if I could go back. I didn't know if there was a back anymore. I only knew that I was here, I was breathing, and I was going to keep moving one step, one breath, one heartbeat at a time. I walked back toward the camp, my legs feeling heavy, my mind a blank slate. The exhaustion pulling at my eyelids, the weight of the night pressing down on my shoulders. I saw the others, the rest of the unit, waking up, moving with a practiced, weary efficiency, their faces masks of dirt and grit, their eyes reflecting the same hollow exhaustion that I felt in my own. They didn't ask what happened. They didn't need to. They knew the language of the night, the way the world changed when the sun went down, the way the silence could be a weapon, the way the darkness could be a mirror. We were a brotherhood of shadows, bound together by the things we couldn't say, the things we couldn't do, the things we couldn't fix. I sat down in the dirt, the cold earth pressing against my skin, and I felt a sense of belonging, a strange, dark comfort in the knowledge that I was among my own, among the ones who knew the truth, who felt the weight, who understood the cost. We didn't talk. We didn't share stories. We just existed, a group of tired, broken men in a place that didn't know our names, and that was enough. The day started in earnest, the heat building, the dust swirling, the rhythm of the work taking hold, the mundane, repetitive tasks of survival becoming a refuge, a way to keep the mind occupied, to keep the ghosts at bay. I did my part, I cleaned my weapon, I checked my gear, I helped with the supplies, all with a detached, mechanical efficiency that felt like a performance, a role I was playing in a play that had no audience. I watched the world, the desert, the sky, the faces of my comrades, and I saw them through a veil, a thin, translucent barrier that separated me from everything else, a layer of insulation that kept me from feeling too much, from caring too much, from breaking. I knew it was a defense, a survival mechanism, a way to keep the pieces from shattering, and I clutched it tight, nursing it, protecting it, afraid of what would happen if I let it slip, if I let the world in. If I let myself feel the full, crushing weight of the life I had left behind. Then came the call. The radio crackled to life, a harsh, static-filled burst of sound that cut through the silence like a knife, and the voice on the other end, urgent, strained, filled with a panic that was all too familiar, was talking about a situation, a breach, a need for backup. I stood up, my heart accelerating, the adrenaline flooding my system, the familiar, terrifying urge to move, to act. To be there. Henderson looked at me, his eyes intense, his expression a mixture of caution and duty, and we both knew what this was, what this meant, what we had to do. We checked our weapons, our faces set, our bodies shifting into the familiar predatory stance of men who are about to walk into the fire. We moved out, the sun beating down on our backs, the desert stretching out in front of us, an endless, shimmering expanse of danger and opportunity, the tension building. The anticipation a physical ache in our limbs. We didn't talk, we didn't plan, we didn't strategize. We just moved, a single, unified entity, driven by a shared, desperate need to be at the center of the storm, to do the work, to pay the price, to see the end of it all. The travel was a blur of heat and dust and the constant, vibrating hum of the engine, the world passing by in a smear of orange and brown, the occasional, jagged silhouette of a building, a tree, a ridge, marking the time, the distance, the progress. I sat in the back of the transport, my eyes fixed on the horizon, my mind empty, my body prepared, the tension in my limbs a taut wire ready to snap. We arrived at the coordinates just as the sky began to turn a deep, bruised orange, the landscape around us silent, expectant, full of the kind of heavy, suffocating potential that usually signals the start of something bad. I jumped down, the dirt puffing up around my boots, and I looked around. My gaze sweeping the terrain, the buildings, the shadows, looking for the threat, for the enemy, for the reason we were here. We were met by a squad from another unit, their faces raw, their uniforms torn, their expressions a mixture of shock and exhaustion. the kind of look you see when the world has just ended for you and you're waiting for someone to explain why. They didn't speak, they just pointed, their hands shaking, their eyes wide, and we followed, our weapons held tight, our pulses thrumming in our ears, our movements a dance of caution and duty. We entered the building, a structure that had once been a home, a place of life and laughter, and now it was a hollowed-out shell, a skeleton of concrete and rebar, the air thick with the smell of dust and something else, something sharp and metallic that made my stomach turn. We moved through the rooms, our boots crunching on the debris, our shadows dancing on the walls in the dim, shifting light, the tension so thick you could taste it, the air a physical weight against our skin. I saw it then, the object, the centerpiece, the reason for the chaos, the thing that had caused the world to stop and the people to break. It was a package, a device, a cluster of wires and triggers, and beneath it, a child's toy, a small faded doll that looked like it had been discarded in a rush, a silent, mocking witness to the horror that was about to unfold. I stood there, looking at it, my heart hammering in my ears, my breath trapped in my throat, the world feeling like it was shrinking, the walls closing in, the light fading, the sound of my own heartbeat the only thing I could hear, the only thing that mattered. I realized that this was it, the event, the moment, the crossroads, and I felt a strange, chilling sense of calm, a realization that there was no way out, no way back, no way to escape the gravity of this, the final, inevitable point of the story. I looked at Henderson, his face a mask of focus, his hands steady as he reached for the tools, his eyes fixed on the device, his entire being a singular, unbreakable effort to neutralize the threat, to save the day, to keep the nightmare at bay. I watched him, my own hands steady, my weapon ready, my eyes sweeping the room, the door, the shadows, waiting, expecting, knowing that the moment was here, that the world was about to tilt on its axis, that whatever happened next would be the end. The truth, the reality I had been running from, the thing I had come here to find, the thing I would carry forever. The air grew still, the silence deepening, the tension reaching a point where it felt like it would shatter. And in that I saw it, the realization that we were not in control, that we were not the masters of our fate, that we were just pawns in a game that was being played by forces we couldn't understand, by gods who didn't care, by a fate that was written in the dust, in the blood, in the final, inevitable end of it all. Henderson moved, his finger sliding, his hand shifting, and the world seemed to hold its breath, a final, suspended second of existence, a blink of time that felt like a lifetime, a moment of such profound, agonizing clarity that I would see it for the rest of my days. The flash of the trigger, the snap of the wire, the sudden, violent release of the energy, the world turning into a storm of flame and sound and debris, the last, desperate act of a man who was already a ghost. I was thrown backward, the force of the blast like a giant hand, a physical blow that shattered the world, the ceiling, the floor, the walls, all collapsing into a swirling, chaotic vortex of darkness and fire. I hit the ground hard, the breath driven out of my lungs, my world dissolving into a storm of gray and black, the ringing in my ears a high, screeching tone that drowned out everything, the pain a distant, secondary concern to the sheer, overwhelming, suffocating reality of the destruction. I lay there for a moment, the dust choking me, the air thick with the taste of pulverized concrete and burning plastic, the world spinning in nauseating arcs, my mind a blank screen. The only thing I could feel was the weight of the air, the cold, hard earth beneath me, the presence of the others or the lack thereof. The silence that followed the blast, the heavy, accusing silence of a world that had been broken, a silence that felt like it would never end, like it was a permanent, immutable part of reality. I tried to move, to push myself up, but my body felt leaden, disconnected, a marionette with cut strings, and I just lay there, looking at the ceiling, the jagged, broken rafters hanging like broken limbs, the sky, the blue, indifferent sky looking down on the wreckage, the sun shining as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't just ended, as if I hadn't just died in some way in this pile of rubble. I crawled forward, my hands finding the grit, the broken glass, the jagged edges of a world that had ceased to be a home, my mind reaching out, searching for the others, for Henderson, for Kowalski, for a sign, a sound, a reason to keep moving, to keep existing. I saw the pile of debris, the mound of stone and metal, the place where the device had been, the place where we had been standing, the place where everything had been real, and I saw a hand, just a hand, protruding from the dust. The fingers spread, the skin pale, the fingernails caked with dirt, a sight that was so simple, so horrifying, so utterly, undeniably true that it felt like it was carved into my brain, an image I would see every time I closed my eyes for the next 40 years. I reached for it, my own hand trembling, my heart a dull, agonizing thud against my ribs, the world spinning, the silence deepening, the air growing colder, the light fading, the sense of everything ending, the sense of being alone, the sense of being the only one left, the only one who knew, the only one who cared, the only one who would remember. I held that hand, the cold, still skin, the limp weight of it, the utter, devastating finality of the touch, and I realized that this was it. The story, the life, the war, the world, all of it boiled down to this one singular, broken, final moment, a point of no return, a place where the map ended and the darkness began, a place where I was standing alone in the wreckage of my own existence, waiting for the dust to settle, waiting for the silence to stop screaming, waiting for the world to start moving again, even though I knew in my bones that it never really would. The dust didn't settle so much as it just hovered, a thick, suffocating veil of gray silt that coated the back of my throat and turned the world into a monochrome nightmare. I don't remember getting up, but my knees were bleeding, the rough fabric of my trousers shredded against the jagged masonry of the floor. Henderson wasn't there. Kowalski wasn't there. There was just the sound of my own pulse, a frantic, wet drumming in my ears, and the distant, rhythmic ticking of cooling metal that sounded like a clock counting down to nothing. I looked at the hand I was holding, and for a long, impossible minute, I tried to convince myself that if I just squeezed hard enough, if I poured enough of my own heat into those cold, stiff fingers, the pulse would return. It was a delusion born of shock, a childish, desperate prayer whispered into the ruins, but it was the only thing keeping my lungs from collapsing entirely. I sat there in the rubble for what might have been 10 minutes or 10 years, the smell of burnt hair and pulverized lime clinging to my skin like a second coat. The silence of the desert outside the ruined walls felt heavy, absolute, a vast and indifferent void that didn't care about the boy from Ohio or the man who had failed to bring him home. The extraction didn't feel like a rescue, it felt like an exhumation. When the others finally arrived, their voices sounded tinny and far away, like radio broadcasts coming from the bottom of an ocean. They lifted me up, and I didn't fight them, even though my chest felt like it was being crushed by a phantom weight. I remember the sensation of being loaded onto the bird, the roar of the rotors vibrating through my teeth, and the way the desert floor receded, becoming a map of brown and ochre that held no history, no memory, no cousin. I spent the flight staring at my boots, watching the red-brown stains darken until they were almost black, trying to memorize the pattern of the dirt so I wouldn't have to look at the empty space where the men I loved should have been. I wasn't thinking about home. Home was a planet I had left light years ago, a place that existed only in the hazy, golden periphery of my mind, a ghost story I told myself to stay awake. I was already halfway to a place where words like mother, girl, and porch didn't carry any weight, a country made of static and cold, ironclad endurance. The flight back to the States was a long, hollow silence suspended 30,000 feet above the dark, churning Atlantic. We were all quiet, a cabin full of men who had suddenly become heavy, our heads bowed as if we were collectively mourning the parts of ourselves we had left behind in the dirt. I remember the pilot's voice coming over the intercom, something about landing in New Jersey, but the words meant nothing to me. When we touched down, the tarmac looked fake. The lights were too bright, the ground too smooth, the air too clean. I walked off that plane and felt a wave of nausea so profound I had to lean against the side of the fuselage, waiting for the earth to stop tilting. There was a crowd of people near the terminal, holding signs and waving flags, and for a second, I felt a spark of pure, unadulterated rage. They were cheering for a version of me that didn't exist anymore, for a man who had gone away with clear eyes and a steady heart. The man who had walked off that ramp was hollow, a suit of clothes filled with dust and the echoes of things that couldn't be spoken. I saw her standing by the gate, her coat pulled tight against the late autumn chill, her face paler than I remembered, her eyes searching the faces of every man walking off that plane. When she found me, she didn't run, she stopped. Her hands coming up to cover her mouth, a small, choked sound escaping her. I walked toward her, and every step felt like I was walking through deep, wet sand. When I reached her, I couldn't wrap my arms around her. I stood there, stiff and freezing, and she stepped into me, pressing her face into my chest, her tears soaking into the rough canvas of my jacket. I could smell the familiar scent of her shampoo, a smell that had haunted my nights for months, but it felt wrong now, a sharp, jarring contrast to the metallic tang of the desert that still lived in the pores of my skin. I held her, but I wasn't really there. My hands felt like blocks of wood, and my heart was a stone, locked away behind a door I didn't have the key to anymore. She squeezed me tighter, begging me to say something, but I couldn't find the words. The only thing I could think of was the sound of the metal ticking in the dark, and how quiet the desert had been after the fire died. The house was exactly the same, which was the hardest part. The same photos on the mantle, the same chipped mug in the cupboard, the same creak in the floorboard in the hallway. It was a museum of a life that no longer had a resident. That first night, I laid in our bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Every time a car drove past outside, every time the wind brushed against the siding of the house, my muscles coiled, my breath hitched, and my hands instinctively reached for the rifle that wasn't there. She slept beside me, her breathing steady and soft, and I hated myself for the distance between us, for the fact that she was a stranger I shared a bed with. I got up at 3 in the morning, walked into the kitchen, and sat at the table in the dark. I drank a glass of cold water, the glass sweating in my grip, and I watched the streetlights flicker through the curtains. I realized then that I hadn't come home. I had just moved to a different theater of war, one where the enemies were memories, and the terrain was a minefield of normalcy that I didn't know how to navigate. The weeks that followed were a blur of small, sharp failures. I tried to go back to the garage where I'd worked, but the smell of oil and burnt rubber made my pulse spike until the blood hammered in my temples. I'd walk out, go to my truck, and sit there for 2 hours, staring at the dashboard, wondering if I was ever going to be able to turn the key again. I went to the VA office in the city, sitting in a plastic chair in a room that smelled like floor wax and old coffee, listening to a man in a blazer tell me about coping mechanisms and breathing exercises. He kept using the word transition, as if what I'd gone through was a change in career rather than a total disintegration of the soul. I didn't tell him about the hand in the rubble. I didn't tell him about the way I still woke up screaming because the smell of peppermint soap had invaded my dreams. I just nodded, checked the boxes on his forms, and drove home in a silence so thick it felt like I was driving underwater. I was managing, but I wasn't living. I was just keeping the shell intact, hoping that if I stayed still enough, the fractures wouldn't spread. I remember the first time I laughed. It was 6 months later. At my sister's house for a Sunday barbecue, someone told a story about a tractor mishap, and for a split second the humor hit me, a genuine, warm bubble of recognition. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh and then it stopped. It didn't taper off, it cut out like a light switch had been thrown. I looked across the yard, past the kids running through the sprinklers, past the adults holding paper plates, and I saw the desert. I saw the heat haze, the flies, the way the light died on the horizon. I stood there with my mouth open, the half-finished laugh dead in my throat, feeling like a total alien in my own family's backyard. My sister looked at me, her eyes clouded with a gentle, terrifying concern, and I just shook my head and walked away toward the barn. I sat on the fence line, looking out at the cornfields, and I felt the guilt wash over me, the crushing, heavy realization that I was alive, that I was eating, that I was laughing while they were still in the dirt. Still in the dark, still waiting for a rescue that never came. Survival isn't a victory. It's an endurance test where the finish line keeps moving. I learned that the hard way, through nights where the house felt like a bunker and days where the grocery store felt like a patrol. But eventually the tremors slowed. The panic attacks grew fewer, though they never quite left. They just became like a thunderstorm that you learned to read the barometer for. I started walking, miles every day, out into the woods behind the old property line. I walked until my legs burned and my mind was blank, until the only thing that existed was the rhythmic crunch of boots on leaves and the cold, biting air in my lungs. It was in those woods, in the quiet, green, wet stillness of an Ohio autumn, that I finally started to breathe again. I wasn't the man I had been, and I wasn't the soldier I had become. I was something else, a patched-together creature held together by habit and the stubborn, irrational fact that I was still here. I realized that the guilt I carried wasn't a punishment I had to earn. It was just a price I had paid, and I could either carry it like a shroud or wear it like a scar. Hope didn't come back all at once. It wasn't a sudden epiphany or a sunrise over a calm sea. It came back in small, quiet, boring ways. It came back when I started fixing the old truck, not because I needed it, but because I liked the way the wrench felt in my hand, the way the engine finally turned over, a steady, rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat. It came back when I sat on the porch with her and we didn't talk, but we didn't feel the need to fill the space either. We just existed together, two people who had survived a long, cold winter. It came back the day I finally went to the cemetery and sat by the stone that had his name on it, not to cry and not to apologize, but just to tell him about the way the wind sounded in the trees back home. I realized then that I didn't need to be fixed. I just needed to be able to hold the broken pieces without cutting myself every time I moved. The horror of what I had seen was still there, a dark, silent continent in the back of my mind. But I wasn't living on that continent anymore. I was standing on the shore, watching the tide go out, knowing that I could stay here in the light as long as I kept my feet moving. I'm sitting in this chair now, in the quiet of a house that finally feels like mine again. It's 2 in the morning and the coffee in my mug has long since gone cold, but I don't mind. The silence in the room isn't the screaming silence of the desert anymore. It's just the quiet of the night, the sound of the house settling, the distant, muffled noise of a truck passing on the county road. My wife is asleep upstairs, her breathing rhythmic and safe, and I know that when I go up there, I won't have to check the windows or the locks because I've already done it and because I'm home. I look at my hands, they're older now, calloused, the knuckles a little stiff from the damp, but they're steady. I don't look for the blood anymore. I don't expect the world to explode when I turn the corner. I've learned that the monster isn't waiting for me in the dark. The monster is just a memory, and I've learned how to look at it without letting it take me back. I'm still here, and for the first time in a long, long time, I think that might be enough. I'm not a hero, and I'm not a victim, and I'm certainly not a man who has all the answers. I'm just a guy who went away to do something hard, lost everything he thought he needed, and came back to find that life doesn't stop just because you want it to. I still think about them every day. I think about the way Henderson laughed when he was trying to clean his glasses, and I think about the way the sky looked right before the world tore itself apart. Those moments don't leave you, they just become part of the scenery, like a mountain in the distance that you don't climb anymore, but you always keep in your sight. I've stopped trying to reconcile the boy who left with the man who returned because they are two different people, and both of them had to survive their own version of the fire. I'm proud of the man who walked out of the rubble, even if I don't recognize him in the mirror half the time. He did the only thing he could do. He kept going. And that, I've found, is the only real victory a man gets in this life. My daughter is going to wake up in 3 hours, and she's going to run into the kitchen asking for cereal, and I'm going to be there to pour it for her. That's all the future I need to worry about right now. I'm done with the big questions, the grand narratives, the search for some profound meaning in the chaos. There is no meaning in a blast, in a loss, in the sudden, violent erasure of a cousin, a friend, a world. There is only the living that happens after. I have a job, I have a bed, and I have a life that is small and quiet and entirely mine. I still have the nightmares, but they're starting to lose their teeth, and I still wake up some mornings feeling like the ghost. But I just go outside, breathe the cold air, and remind myself that I'm standing on solid ground. It's a good enough life. It's a life built on a foundation of ash, but it's standing, and as long as I'm the one holding it up, it's not going anywhere. I'm okay with that. I'm more than okay with that. Tomorrow is going to be another Tuesday, and I'll get up, and I'll go to the garage, and I'll do the work, and I'll come home to the people who still see me, even when I'm halfway gone in my own head. I've stopped looking for a sign that it was all worth it, because the worth isn't in the mission, it's in the survival. It's in the small, stubborn persistence of a heart that refuses to stop beating, even when it's been broken into 1,000 pieces. I don't tell this story to be heard, and I don't tell it to be understood, because there are some things that can only be understood by the person who carried them. I tell it because the air feels a little lighter when the words are out, and because maybe, if I say it out loud, I can finally stop carrying the weight of the silence. I'm not done yet. And I don't think I ever will be, but for the first time I'm not afraid of the next day. I'm just looking forward to the coffee, the morning light, and the simple, ordinary, blessed weight of being exactly where I am. The sun will come up over the cornfields in a few hours, just like it always does, and the world will keep turning, regardless of what we think we left behind in the dark.